How do you define wealth? Many may say it means owning lavish houses, driving fancy cars, or wearing luxury clothes. The reality is, our collective idea of wealth has been programmed by harmful players to feed our greed for material needs. And yet, this has actually left us bankrupt in more ways than one. See, for centuries, the idea of wealth, or what we think of as financial power, has actually been shaped by colonial periods of land dispossession, ecological extraction, and labor exploitation, typically at the expense of humans of a certain hue. But is that kind of wealth the key to our liberation? Do we really got to step on another's neck to get ahead? Or, just hear me out, is it time to reimagine wealth accumulation as a process not predicated on violence and endless competition, but, I don't know, let's say care or solidarity? What if we reframe wealth through a lens of collective well being? I'm Darren from PushBlack, and you're listening to Black History Year. Throughout our history, our people have been terrorized by racial capitalism, a system that oppresses the many for the profit of a few. And yet, against all odds, we finesse ways to meet our material needs within, outside, and beyond this system. And we've done it by keeping alive our tradition of collectivity, carried with us from the continent to today. Now, before y'all start talking about generational wealth and closing the racial wealth gap, look, let me just introduce today's guest. She's an incredible writer, activist, and scholar who doesn't shy away from digging through the lost and found boxes of our past to reconnect with our cultural legacies. I'm talking about Jessica Ann Mitchell Aiwuyor, the founder of the National Black Cultural Information Trust and a leading voice in the fight for reparations. She brings unparalleled insight into how redefining wealth and reclaiming our cultural heritage can lead to Black liberation. So I ain't gonna hold y'all. Grab a seat, open your mind, and get ready to question everything you think you know about wealth. Let's get it. What's up, fam? Before we dive into the episode, I have one small favor to ask. Please spread the word about Black History Year on social media. Podcasting is competitive, y'all, and the best way to grow is through your promotion. You can shout out this episode or share one lesson from it you found super interesting. Just tag us at We Are Push Black on Instagram and TikTok so more folks can access the Black history they didn't teach us in school. Your support means the world to us, and your minute of effort makes our hours of work worth it. So thank you, fam. Now, let's get back to the show. Hey, how you doing today, Jessica?
I'm good. How you doing, Darren?
I'm good, and I'm happy to be in conversation with you. Thank you so much for taking time to meet with us. And I ain't gonna hold you. We're just gonna jump right in. The way that we like to start our conversations here at Black History Year, we like to hear from our guests, particularly around what they believe Black liberation is. So, with that said, Jessica, I want to know, what does Black liberation look like and feel like to you?
Oh, a whole lot of things. To me, Black liberation looks like and feels like self determination, independence, freedom. It feels like having control over your own presence and destiny and future. It feels like being able to plan um, for not only right now, but for centuries to come.
Mm,
Um, Black liberation feels like having a grounding, feels like being able to pour into ourselves with no type of conflict or deterrence. And it
mm.
also feels like being able to fully trust our own selves and our beings to know what's right for our own lives and our own futures.
Oh my goodness. Thank you so much for that rich response. I'm hearing so much there. So autonomy, the ability to kind of control our destinies, not just for now, but for future generations, the ability to actually actualize the way that we think and be in this world. Absolutely. I love that. And now, just to kind of set the stage for our conversation, we're here to talk about decolonizing wealth, or to reframe how we even think about wealth and what it could offer us in terms of Black liberation. You spoke about this piece of autonomy, the ability to control how we live and how we move in the world. And I just want to kind of set the historical stage to dive into this conversation. So we want to talk a little bit about Seneca Village. We'll talk a little bit about Black Wall Street and also Booker T. Washington's Atlanta Compromise. But just to get us started, I want to talk about Seneca Village. Now, so for folks who may be unfamiliar, Seneca Village, when we think of historical times when Black people were able to exercise their freedom to create spaces for themselves, even within a white supremacist, capitalist, colonial society, the story of Seneca Village readily comes to mind. So, Seneca Village was a village created in the mid 1800s along a landscape what is now known as Central Park in New York. And this line Central Park's perimeter from West 82nd to West 89th Street. And this was a community of predominantly Black folks, African Americans who owned their property. And in fact, by 1855, the village actually consisted of about 225 residents and one third Irish immigrants, a few folks of German descent as well. But what's really interesting about this space is this is one of the first times in the New World, in the Western world, that Black folks were able to actually control their space, to actually cohere a community, actually build up institutions to serve themselves. And when I think about this, it actually leaves me a little bit heartbroken when I think about how it resulted. So specifically, New York ended up acquiring this land through what we now know as eminent domain. Essentially, they said, "Hey, we want this property, we want this land, we need y'all to come up out of it," and they were moved from that space. Now, there's been excavations and archaeological digs for the past like 20 years that have found remnants of Seneca Village and all the innovative ways that they were able to create space. However, for our conversation, Jessica, what I want to know is, Seneca Village was really built on this premise of wealth, this notion of like land ownership, financial independence, and community. This would equate to some semblance of power, some semblance of freedom. But I'm curious, what variable can we add to this equation? Um, how might we rethink Seneca Village in a way that could, I don't know, present more liberatory opportunities for us thinking about creating community today?
When I think about it, first of all, knowing that our ancestors were able to accomplish these things with a lot of, in a time period where they don't have as much of access to many of the financial or material opportunities that we would have access to today. So, if they were able to accomplish Seneca Village with the limits of that time period, imagine what we can do today.
Mhm.
Another thing that I take away from the lessons from Seneca Village and other neighborhoods like this across the country is that we can foresee not only the possibilities but the potential roadblocks
Mm.
and plan ahead to navigate against those for future projects, future initiatives, future community planning to be able to protect our communities as we move forward.
Thinking about this notion of protecting our communities, that leads me right into thinking about Black Wall Street and the Tulsa massacre. What what would you imagine the takeaway is there for us, for folks who are thinking about land ownership and wealth accumulation? But how do we protect this? Any insights there?
Yeah, in terms of Tulsa, in terms of the various Black Wall Streets and communities that were destroyed, I think one of the key takeaways there is that we are a communal people and that we need to depend and rely on that community in order to move forward. One of the things that the Tulsa race massacre was horrific, but it didn't end or annihilate the community. The community rebuilt.
Hmm.
And so I think that is one of the takeaways, but also understanding that what we're up against. For the longest, from the beginning, since emancipation, there's been this idea that African Americans are lazy. And we know that comes from a white supremacist idea, right? That we need to pull ourselves up from the bootstraps. And yet we could build the entire boot and the straps from scratch, and here comes somebody trying to burn that down. Here comes somebody trying to take it out
Hmm.
of out out of pure hatred, but also out of jealousy for not
Mhm.
only our resilience, but our innovation. And I think that as a people, we can continue to tap in and recognize our own creativity and our own innovation for our own material, spiritual, economic, and so forth needs. Um,
Mhm.
and within that, thinking creatively about how to find ways to control the mechanisms that um, surround our
Mhm.
daily lives and
Mm.
find ways to protect our daily lives in different ways. And we did have people in the various Black communities that were protectors, that
Mm.
did fight back, that did have coalitions and mechanisms in place to warn communities when danger is near, and to have their own mechanisms for fighting back against the Klan and other entities. A lot of times, a lot of this is done, like you mentioned, through government initiatives, so eminent domain and so forth. Um, and now we have coalitions of Black lawyers and organizations that are even still fighting back against the remnants and the horrors of how eminent domain was used to destroy Black communities and take Black properties away.
It makes me think about the need for another type of agency, right? We often think about money and finances equating to power, and in some semblance, it absolutely does. But you spoke about just the governments, right? Government institutions, this kind of moving goalpost as it relates to just Black ownership, right? Yes, we own this space, but the government can decide to do whatever they want with these spaces that we are able to kind of create. Um, I love that you mentioned that we're able to take up more positions, whether we're lawyers or in electoral politics. Absolutely, it feels necessary. But it seems like just the mechanisms of government has to be engaged when we think about wealth accumulation, wealth preservation, and just protecting ourselves as well. Now, whether that happens like within formal government institutions or like more ad hoc committees or groups, organizations, we're able to kind of fight off white vigilantism. We need it all, it seems like. Would you say?
I definitely would say. And I'd also like to uplift our ancestors that so many of these are communities that our ancestors created, but then there were some of our ancestors that were in maroon communities that were designed and created internally and kind of insulated because of the decisions that they made in order to create and protect and shield their communities from white backlash.
Yes,
And we
indeed.
can learn from those maroon communities as well.
Yes, yes. Actually, I was going to wait till we start to get to the future section where we could speculate what might wealth look like in the future. How can we rethink wealth? Actually, I'm going to just name drop this now. Have you ever heard of a book titled On Property by Ronaldo Walcott?
I have heard of it, but I have not read that book. Mhm.
So on property, so Ronaldo Walcott is a Caribbean scholar, teaches out of Toronto right now, I believe, very much involved in the Black Studies tradition. In that book, he explicitly looks at maroon societies and how they're able to
Mhm.
rethink our relationship with land, with each other by rethinking this notion of property, right? We have to remember, our ancestors were considered property at one time. And that should kind of force us to rethink our relationship to natural resources that we use to kind of live today. And maroonage absolutely can be a model for thinking about autonomous communities. And then also, like, just the different social dynamics that are created once we're able to kind of construct our own governance models. Um,
Yes.
all that. Thank you so much for lifting up maroonage, Jessica. I appreciate that.
Yeah, I just think we don't think about that enough. I think that in terms of post emancipation, the post period of slavery, um, we don't think enough about the different circumstances that our ancestors went through, survived, or created. And
Mhm.
so for some reason, maroons are consistently erased from that conversation. And I think it's often It may not be deliberate, but it feels deliberate to me
Yes.
because maroonage has its such an extreme level of self sufficiency and independence that is off grid and not necessarily government controlled and all of the things. And so it's so much that we can learn from that in terms of creativity in Black futures that I always am baffled when maroonage is not brought up. The same thing with uh, the obsession with the date 1619. So
Mm,
it's important. It is an important date for the beginning of slavery in English speaking North America, in the English speaking the United States, well, what became the United States. But it's the beginning of slavery in Virginia. But we
mm-hmm.
had ancestors that were enslaved in the southern region of what became the United States in 1526. It was a group of Africans brought by the Spanish. And the first, what they did was burnt the settlement down, never
Yes.
to be heard of again. Historians speculating that the local Native Americans may have taken them in, and that is such a powerful testimony to the beginning of African American existence in the United States. You mean the beginning is struggle. You mean the beginning is a fight for self sufficiency. You mean the beginning is self determination. You mean the beginning is fighting back against your enslavers. You mean the beginning is burning down this colony so they can't establish it. That is some powerful history that we don't tap into enough.
Oh
So,
my
like,
God.
I am begging people to really look into the robustness of African American history and African diasporic history outside of the narratives that we are constantly fed, because
Mm.
oftentimes the narratives that are constantly popularized or pushed are, they have certain limits to them that can stifle how we interpret our history and or present time and futures.
Yo, Jessica, that's everything. We don't need to continue the interview. That's it. No, that was amazing. Thank you so much. And that speaks directly to our intentions here at Push Black with the way that we share history and specifically history of these little known stories, these little known victories, achievements that most folks overlook or it's erased. Specifically because we want to expand the imaginary of what it is we have done and what it is we can do today and what we can do in the future. I believe if folks had that understanding of this maroonage beginning, that would absolutely shape how we move and think about what we could do right now and achieve in the future. And it's just amazing that this happens almost 300 years before the independence of Haiti.
Mm-hmm.
Which is often celebrated as like, oh, this is one of the first times we got free in the Western world. And this predates that by like almost 300 years on American soil. Such a powerful, powerful reflection. But it also makes me think about this, Jessica. I want to kind of juxtapose that method of, let's say, wealth accumulation, what the Maroons were able to do in that context, with, say, a Booker T. Washington, right? So, mentioned earlier the Atlanta Compromise. And for folks who may be unfamiliar, the Atlanta Compromise was a speech given by Booker T. Washington, who was at that time the president of the Tuskegee Institute. And he gave this speech to the Cotton States and International Exposition of Atlanta. And this happens in September 1895. And here, Booker T told us to cast down our bucket where we are and really emphasizing for the first time that Blacks shouldn't fight for the right to vote. Um, and we actually should not retaliate against racist behavior. Don't retaliate against segregation or discrimination, but instead build up a trade, learn a trade, who kind of contribute to an industry, start a business, to prove our worth. And then we would be granted more political agency. Now that is radically different than, burning down a colony. But I'm just curious how that method kind of resonates with you. Booker T saying like, hey, let's just get our money right, and once we do that, we'll prove our worth to the white world. I'm curious, how does that land with you?
Well, during that time period, he was going back and forth with W.E.B. Du Bois, who believed at the time of the notion of the talented 10th, which he later disengaged from, um,
Mm-hmm.
which often people leave out. But uh, I think there needs to be a combination of both of their ideologies in terms of exposure to um, the arts and exposure to academia and exposure to higher learning, but also having that grounding in a trade. I
Mm-hmm.
believe that, and Booker T. Washington um, was right in his concern for us to have trades. Even now, having trade skills are very beneficial for self sufficiency, especially for people, and not just for people that didn't attend college, for everyone to have some type of core function that they can contribute to society that is beneficial to themselves and to others. I
Mm-hmm.
think that there is a duality between what Booker T. Washington was trying to say here, even though we know components of that speech were meant to uh, lessen the fears of Southern whites that were afraid that the Negroes would rise up and try to get all our rights at once. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but another part of that is Booker T was a trickster. He knew by making these types of speeches, they gave money. That money to this date sustains Tuskegee Institute, which is now Tuskegee University. And I'll never forget one of the things that Dr. John Henrik Clarke said about Booker T. Washington. He said, y'all shuck and jive for a whole lot of things, basically, and you got nothing for it. At
Mm-hmm.
least Booker T shuck and jived and got a whole school for it that you can look and see the benefits, not the benefits of shucking and jiving, but to see what his end goal was there. Now we can look back and see that thousands of Black students are educated through what was founded by Booker T. And so, and another component of that is secretly there has been some historical discussions about Booker T potentially actually donating to many of those Black movements that were pushing for Black voting rights, but just not doing it in the open.
Wow.
So, so I disagree that we should not vote, that we should not push for our civil and human rights, which a lot of other um, African Americans at that time disagreed with him, and so on. Many have critiqued Booker T. Washington for the things that he has said, and that those are often valid criticisms. But we have to also look at the things that were valid that he said about having a trade and about trying to get some type of economic stability. If we look back at our families that were surviving during the era of Jim Crow, a lot of times they survived based on intercommunal economic exchanges or mutual aid exchanges. So, I watch your kids, you give me some money, you're able to go work, I do your laundry, you provide me with some of your vegetables from your garden or your fruits. These are different things. Or you build things for people within the community, or you are the person that knows how to read and write good. Okay, you're going to fill out the documents for folks that don't know how to do it so we can get this situated. These are all the different mechanisms that came about in Black communities. And as far as trade, being able to build, being able to create, being able to farm, being able to, these are things that he put within Tuskegee Institute. Those students built those buildings. Those students farmed their own food. That is a core component of maroonage and self sufficiency. So there's just a lot of things that I think people should look at Booker T. Washington through a lens that is more holistic,
Mm-hmm.
instead of harping on the I don't want to say don't critique him, but look at him through a more holistic lens. I am one of those people that, when it comes to my ancestors, I have a lot more grace than anything. I can't help but have that. Booker T. Washington was a formerly enslaved man. You
Hmm.
know, he has his own different experiences where he felt like, maybe we just need to get our own stuff and do our own thing and not worry about that. But I think that he was being a bit of a trickster there. I don't think that through the ways, his actions, and the fruit that came out from his work, there's just a lot more to be admired or discovered there.
That absolutely provides me a different lens by which I can understand Booker T. And absolutely, I just want to support what you were saying. When we think of our ancestors, it doesn't help to kind of just denigrate their methods of trying to achieve some semblance of liberation. They were using the tools which they had at that time. And when I hear that Booker T may have been kind of funneling some money to some more kind of radical or progressive Black groups, that actually just kind of tickles my fancy. I love to hear that so much. Um, but one thing does come up for me before we transition and we talk about the present day section. Absolutely want to dive into your history as a reparationist and how you came to this work. There's like a little personal anecdote that's coming to mind. I just feel like I have to share this. So, in my family, so I'm from Louisiana, have a huge family. I often would ask my elders, and I don't know if you've heard this, Jessica, but sometimes some Black elders feel like, the Black community kind of took a shift at some point. We're not as together as we once were. And I would ask them, I was like, okay, when did that come up for y'all? When did y'all start to feel like we weren't like a cohesive community anymore? And more often than not, so grandparents, my own parents, and aunties, uncles, often they will point to some of the gains made after the civil rights movement. In their understanding, once a certain contingent of Black folks were able to have a bit more advancement, they left. And these were often folks who were very skilled at certain trades, whether it was like dentistry, whether it was law, um, yeah, and they felt like there was a void that happened after that community left. I think what I'm really trying to get at, Jessica, is do you think that wealth, the normative way that we understand it, does it have a tendency to divide Black communities? Would you say that that tracks their reflection on the shapes and shifts in the Black community after certain civil rights wins came about? Yeah, yeah. How does that land with you? Do you think wealth may divide us in some sense or anything like that?
I think wealth in general is a divider when we look at class. When we look
Mm,
at issues of class, there are class divisions
mm,
throughout American society, throughout the world, but throughout American society, and also within the Black American community, there are class divisions. And so with these class divisions, there are going to be divides. I think one of the things that occurred during segregation was that certain people had to be within certain communities because they had to be there because
mm,
there was segregation. So of course, once there is desegregation, there's going to be kind of more of a dispersal. And
mm,
then there's also the issue of, if you don't have wealth already acquired, um, and we're already dealing with issues with not having property,
mm,
centuries of being denied access to property. Um, so then it becomes harder and harder for families to gain home ownership, which is one of the leading ways that you become wealthy or at least have some type of access to wealth in the United States. And
mhm,
so I can see how some people would feel that way. I'm not exactly sure how it tracks, statistically, but we have long dealt with issues of class divisions, which is why when I think about wealth, I'm thinking about the collective versus the individual. And that's pretty much also my stance concerning reparations as well. But
mm,
in terms of wealth, and it definitely is something that impacts each and every family, whether you are in poverty or so-called middle class, upper class, all these type of things. But the class divisions are there. And what happens is, as people gain higher access to economic mobility or have higher access to funds, there are these divides among class that causes rifts within our communities
Mm,
often, and that leads to people feeling
mm,
abandoned by the people that they felt should be able to should at least stay or contribute in some way or align themselves with the overall community. But a lot of
yes.
times when it comes to the folks that are higher up on the wealth end, it doesn't necessarily always go the way in which folks would want it to go.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you for that. I have one small follow-up question on this. Actually, I'm going to table that. We're going to leave the Black 1% for later in the conversation. But I want to know about your history as a reparationist. Specifically, how did you get into this work, Jessica? And what is the significance of reparations today? Why are we talking about this now?
Okay, so I am from Georgia and South Carolina, and I'm a descendant of Gullah Geechee, um, African Americans from across the state of Georgia and South Carolina. My family was enslaved in both states on my mom and father's side, and sharecroppers in the state of Georgia. And when I was a little girl, my grandmama, Hattie Virginia Jones, she sat down and told me a story about how when she was a little girl, our family escaped from sharecropping. Now, a lot of people, and I've had these battles because I teach Black history on through digital media, and people say, why would they need to escape from sharecropping? Well, when slavery so called ended, people shifted into sharecropping because a lot of folks had nowhere to go.
Mm-hmm.
And so sharecropping became a debt system where everything they were charged for, using the land, tilling the land, staying here, you get something from the store, you charge you. And these charges, of course, are predatory, outrageous, often unfounded.
Mm-hmm.
And uh, people had to literally escape from sharecropping. It wasn't that you could walk away, they could have you arrested for leaving. Even if you're there unjustly and feel that you are wrongly in debt, that you should be able to have your freedom anyway. But slavery, basically under another name, is what sharecropping was.
Yes.
It definitely was an extension of chattel slavery. And so my family in Warren, Georgia was still sharecropping at this time when my grandmother was a very young child. And she had this memory of being like kind of carted off away in the middle of the night. I
Wow.
can't exactly remember the story, but I believe it is that my the white sharecropper plantation owner came to the house and wanted to know where one of my great grandparents was. And they lied and said the other one left them. They left me and took the kids, you know. And really what happened is they packed the kids up in the middle of the night and fled to Augusta, Georgia.
Wow.
And then the other one left and followed them to Augusta when the coast was clear. But and these are people that I personally know. Flossie is my great grandmother, and George, my great grandfather. They are passed away now.
Mm.
But when I learned that story, and I'm thinking, as a child, these are my people. Like they really couldn't leave. Like they
Yeah.
couldn't. And as when you're young and you're learning about slavery and sharecropping and these type of things, but then there's this direct connection to your family. It makes an impression on you.
Absolutely.
knowing that these sweet people, Flossie and George, they used to give me candy and tell me stories and rock me in the rocking chair. These are the people that you basically enslaved. These are my people. And even through decades later, George was afraid that the man was coming to get him, feeling like he was around the corner coming to
Wow.
get him. So this is people living under terror. And ever since I learned more about my history as a child, I was very into Black history. So I eventually, when I went to college, I majored in African World Studies at Fort Valley State University in Fort Valley, Georgia, HBCU. And then I went on to get a master's in Pan African Studies from Syracuse University, and also a master of science in public relations.
Okay.
So I wanted to be able to do the work of speaking for my community and pushing our initiatives in a way that makes sense communications wise.
Okay.
That is utilizing strategic communications. And so that's pretty much how I started getting involved in um, understanding anti-slavery movements and civil rights and human rights. And then much later on, um, as I was already working in the field of disinformation and how Black communities were being targeted,
Mm.
I noticed that one of the ways that we were being targeted online was through what was happening was cultural mis and disinformation. So, cultural disinformation basically utilizes aspects of our Black historical existence and twists them in order to fuse in false information and get communities to do what they want them to do. In this aspect, with the cultural disinformation, it was around the 2020 election, trying to tell Black communities if we don't get reparations, we shouldn't vote.
Oh,
And so
oh, I'm sorry. Is this related to American descendants of slavery at all? ADOS and that movement, or similar movements like that, or
it's
no?
similar.
Am I
Some
misreading
people, some no, you're not misreading it, but it's not just one group.
that?
Um,
Okay.
I would say that it is, and it's not always an entity that you would realize or know where it would come from.
Wow.
So there was research done by a woman named Ann Mitchell from Stop Online Violence Against Women that studied how this disinformation was utilizing all these different social justice movements and twisting them to try to get people to not vote, to enact Black voter suppression.
Wow.
So I became more involved because I wanted to make sure that we got the story right, the message right. And I was working at the time already with Black reparations organizations and helping with communications. And so I just kept going deeper into that. And I currently have two reparations programs through my organization, the National Black Cultural Information Trust. One is about reparations.org, which teaches people the history of reparations and shows people the current reparations task forces and movements. And then another one is called Communicating Reparations, where we work directly with reparations task forces in the different cities across the country to help them with strategic communications because they're being attacked left and right by different conservative groups that are anti-reparations, and they're doing disinformation, and
Mm.
media is getting things messed up and providing misinformation. So there's just a lot going around there, and that is part of the work that I'm doing. Another thing that we're working on is Protect Black History. And
Okay.
Protect Black History is our initiative where we're sending out books in locations where diversity, equity, and inclusion and Black history are being banned by the local government. And so we would partner with local nonprofits to be able to send out books that they would share, Black history books that they would share with the local community and get access to those outside of government. interference.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. I need to take a moment. That was a lot. Thank you.
Yeah.
Amazing work that you're doing. I don't want to derail us too much. Just to stay along this line of thinking, what are we getting wrong? Well, I want to know from your perspective, Jessica, when we talk about reparations, even like the disinformation that's coming in, framing the conversation, what are like some of the more reoccurring misconceptions around reparations? And, if we could just set the record straight right here, how do you think about reparations, or how do you feel we should be talking and thinking about reparations?
I think like the number one misconception about reparations is that it is that we are not owed reparations.
Yes.
That is one of the number one. And then there's a number two one I'll get to. But the number one misconception is that because none of us in this time period were enslaved, we are not owed reparations. That is such a major point of misinformation and miseducation. Reparations are more for chattel slavery. They are for chattel slavery, but they are more than for chattel slavery. They are for also the vestiges of chattel slavery, which would
Mm,
include Jim Crow, which would include all those redlining laws, which would include all that eminent domain snatching the properties away from our ancestors, which would include the police brutality,
mm,
which would include all of these different things and modern day systemic racism. So, yes, we are owed reparations. We are definitely owed reparations. And the way that I see reparations is juxtaposed against another misconception that reparations are only about cash or a check.
what?
Reparations,
What?
yes. And that's another misconception because, yeah, we want a check. I would love a check.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
But it is way more than that because if we don't deconstruct these white supremacist systems that are constantly attacking our communities, we could get a check tomorrow and it would be gone.
Mm-hmm.
Not because we, spent it frivolously, which a lot of people say we would do. It don't matter what we would do with it. It's our money. But the point is the systems that are currently attacking our communities often have a financial component to them. Our communities are still highly segregated, limited in terms of economic resources. They're underbanked.
Mm,
They're very vulnerable economically, and so we need to deconstruct these systems in order to be able to have a sufficient future. The check
yes.
is not going to be enough. I'm a part of the National African American Reparations Commission, and we have a whole 10-point plan for comprehensive reparations. And in
Okay.
this, it includes the right to return, the right for repatriation. It includes support for communications and information infrastructure. It includes access to health care. It includes reparatory justice in terms of
Mm,
education and the unjust policing system. It has all of these points. It's not just one thing, it's not just a check. When we talk about reparations, we need to be thinking about comprehensive reparations that is holistic, that looks at our daily lives and how our lives are impacted by the vestiges of chattel slavery, and look at all of the components. It's not just money that we're missing. It's not
mhm.
just money that we're missing. Money is would be helpful, but that's not the only thing. We have so many different components of our lives that need to be repaired and restored.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Oh my gosh. This brings up a very big and somewhat kind of vague question. I'm just curious from your perspective, Jessica. Why is it we equate money with power? So just thinking about the reparations conversation, a lot of folks do feel like, no, we just, need that check. And I always ask, like, what dollar amount could you put on that for like black liberation? How much money do you think we each individually need or our families need for us to be free, especially without considering these larger structural issues and institutions that still guide our lives? It just makes no sense. But it just raises the question to me. It's like, why are we committed to this idea that money is power? What do you think about that?
I mean, that's a part of the American dream, right? To
Yeah.
ascend, and we America tend and the world tends to associate wealth with power, because with wealth, people are often able to access things that they did not have before. That is why people do that type of association. But when we're talking about our communities as a collective, we have to understand that there has to be more than wealth accumulation. Wealth is very important because we need it to get out of impoverishment. We need it for the future of Black America. But we need a structural overhaul as
Yes.
well. We need a whole structural systemic overhaul that does away with anti-black systems. That is black forward thinking and futuristic. Um, I think, yeah, we think about money. That is always going to be a key concern, but the goal for Black futures is to change our world, and we
Yes.
need more than money to do that. We need money, but we need more than money to do that.
Okay, look, this leads me right into the last portion of our conversation. I love that you mentioned just this futurist thinking that we have to hold on to. I love this holistic reimagining of what reparations could be for us. Um, well, since we're here to talk about decolonizing wealth, internally here at Push Black, us and the producers, we were thinking about like how do we redefine and reimagine wealth? So we wanted to come up with an acronym, and if you don't mind, Jessica, we're gonna speculate. We don't
Okay.
know where we're gonna land. We don't know how we're gonna get there. We just know we're gonna go through it together. We're
Okay.
gonna try to reshape wealth through this acronym. So, wealth spelled WEALTH. I'm gonna just lay out each word for the acronym, and then we're gonna go through it one by one. How does that sound?
Great.
All right, all right. So, wealth, the W, wellness. E, economics. A, agency. L, livingness. T, thought, and H for health. So we're trying to get at this holistic model, rethinking wealth, kind of similar to the proposal for reparations you just talked about. But let's just start with wellness. When we were doing our check-in, Jessica, we talked about having an abundant mindset versus a scarcity mindset. Me,
Hmm.
when I think about wellness, I'm thinking about a healthy balance between the mental and spiritual dimensions of our lives, right? Sort of like an ideological way of thinking and being in the world. But with all that said, how might an abundant mindset lead to more wellness than a scarcity mindset?
I think an abundant mindset would help us really understand what it is that we need, internally and externally and holistically. Um,
Mhm.
and I think oftentimes when we even talking about reparatory justice, we do look at it with a limited mindset, like how much is available and is it going to be enough for all of us? And no, they can't be included because then we won't get this or that. And if we're looking at um, wellness and really taking a deep dive into that, we would know that there's just so many possibilities, because
Mm,
wellness encapsulates, like you said, the spiritual, it encapsulates the physical, the
mm,
mental. It has a lot to do with your environment, and many Black communities are situated in situations where they are in polluted communities, environmental racism and pollution. So there's so many different possibilities to reimagine our lives through the lens of wellness. And if we look at it with an abundant mindset, it comes with more than one type of healing. It comes with
yes.
looking at healing as central to our lives in so many different ways.
Man, that makes me want to go right into the E. So thinking about this scarcity mindset, talking about economics, um, I personally find too often there's a lack of creativity and imagination when we think about an economic system that can provide for all of us. And thinking about that scarcity mindset, it seems like this capitalistic system is built off of just privatization, creating a sense of scarcity amongst naturally abundant resources. When I think about economics, it's really like just a science about how we allocate resources. With that said, how might we retool the economy or ways of economic thinking that could be more holistic for us today?
I think one of the main things is if we're looking at economics through abundance, one of the things that comes to mind to me is the current push for student loan forgiveness. And what is
Okay.
being said is, oh, well, taxpayers are going to take a hit and this, and that. And it's like, okay, well, the people who were students pay taxes as well, and
Hmm.
the money is, we can come up with money for so many different things. We can come up with money for war overnight, literally
Yeah.
billions.
Yeah.
But we can't
Yeah.
come up with money for making sure that the future generations of Americans are educated, have access to this education, and are not burdened by debt. And a lot of that debt burden is on Black students, because guess what? Our ancestors did not have access to wealth, and so they couldn't pay our way through school, and we had to get student loans if we wanted to attend. If we weren't
Mhm.
getting scholarships, we had to get student loans. Overwhelmingly, Black students had to do this. So I like to think about economics through this lens of the collective. What is the most beneficial for the collective? And think about the ways in which the collective can be uplifted. If we were to erase student debt, how much of a jump start would that be for the economy and for Black Americans specifically, no longer being saddled with that debt and being able to further invest in ourselves, our homes,
Mm.
our lives, our communities, our children, without having to basically pay a debt on something that society tells us we have to get in order to succeed. We have to
Gee.
be educated, you know. So but there's so much also with that. Economics is a really big issue, but there's a part of it that I think is missing in terms of reparations. And I have warned of this before in reparations testimony.
Okay.
So in terms of this is why I say we have to think of the collective and we have to think of structural change. I used to be the associate director of communications at the National Fair Housing Alliance. I have witnessed how banks will come in, foreclose on a home. The bank
Mm.
now owns the house, but they won't cut the grass. They won't close the doors on the hinges, and they let the property value drop, and they do it in Black neighborhoods. And the bank owns the home and could make money from it, but instead they allow the home to become dilapidated.
Yeah.
So what that, and another example is many Black communities being underbanked. And banks could have the opportunity for a whole new subset of customers, but won't do it because it's a Black community. What that tells us is money doesn't solve everything, because you can have money, you can have the green, and it's still not enough if there is a system built and persistent on denying you your civil and human rights. And so
Yes.
that's why there has to be, that we do need to focus on economic uplift, but along with that needs to be a structural change so that our communities are still not left vulnerable or ignored or underbanked or underhoused and all of the things.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So much to say. I'm gonna just try to squeeze this in before we move on to the next letter. Um, I'm curious, Jessica, how does certain kind of Black socialist histories or Black anarchist histories and philosophies resonate with you? I'm thinking here about like the solidarity economy. You mentioned education as a resource that we absolutely need to live today. Also thinking about just natural resources and how those are often privatized. Thinking about neoliberalism, how the market tends to kind of drive a lot of decisions today. With all that said, does like Black socialist approaches to economies or Black anarchist approaches to economies or anything else outside of what we have today, does that resonate with you at all? Do you think it has anything to offer us in rethinking economies?
I definitely do. I do think it does have a lot to offer us because it again focuses on the collective instead of the individual. And that is
Hmm.
one of the core components that I think is often missing from these conversations. We want reparations, we want reparatory justice, we want access to economic mobility, but why do we want it? We want it because we want a better society. We want people to have healthy lives. We want people to have fruitful lives, well-rounded lives. And so I think a lot of the socialist or anarchist movements give us some key points to look at in terms of how we rethink society and restructure society for the benefit of the collective in as opposed to the individual.
Okay, let's move on to that A for
Okay.
agency. You were talking about structural changes. I feel like it's going to take some agency to get there. How might we even be thinking about agency, right? Because too often, again, we think with money we'll be able to just, live out our dreams and whatnot. Tabling that, what could agency mean for us? So, like decision making power, whether that's in governance structures as it's currently constructed or outside. Any thoughts there?
I think it has to be both. I think that we already do have many of these coalitions and organizations, but it's not that we can't have more. But I think that we definitely have to be organized and have coalitions that we build that advocate on behalf of our communities. They can advocate through the government, through legal means,
Mm-hmm.
and they can also advocate and organize our communities outside of governmental control. Um, I think that one of the greatest examples of that was the Black Panther Party and the free breakfast and for children that they established, that our government actually stole that idea and
Mm-hmm.
started utilizing for themselves. But there was that sense of agency and community building and organizing. And we always advocate for people to join an organization so that they can get involved in whatever core movement that you are interested in. And if you don't see it, create an organization and be able to come together to advocate for a specific need, for some specific material needs that impact our communities.
This next letter, I'm gonna need a lot of support with you, Jessica. So we got L for livingness here. And the way that we talked about living this internally is really like a Black way of being, of organizing space, but also ourselves. How do we show up day to day in a way that makes us feel safe, makes us feel comfortable? And how do we center what makes us feel good to be alive? So that Black joy, Black juicence, that thirst for life, should that be considered in terms of thinking about living wealthily or having a wealthy life? Any thoughts
Yes.
there?
Yeah,
Yeah.
one of the first crimes against humanity that took place during the transatlantic slave trade and chattel slavery was this attack on our peoplehood, our personhood.
Mm.
And that attack um, really laid the groundwork for anti-Africanity and anti-blackness, which we still deal with today. And within that anti-Africanity and anti-blackness, society has been taught that everything about our history is evil, that blackness is unattractive or ugly, that our hair is bad, that our ways
Yeah.
of being is bad, that our ancestors' ways of worshiping God was evil and bad, that our
Mhm.
ancestors themselves are bad, that everything connected to our history is evil or bad. And Martin Luther King talked about this in one of his speeches where he said somebody told a lie one day that everything black was evil and everything white was good. And I think a lot of times we don't deconstruct enough how that constant anti-Africanity and anti-blackness weighs on us,
Oh my
where we don't get to live our lives as full human beings because we're constantly fighting for our right to exist. Or sometimes we succumb to it and believe in our own um, dehumanization and
yes,
participate in it.
yes,
And so
indeed.
I think in order to access that livingness that you were talking about, we really have to tap into, when we say education, let it be education of African history and African people around the world and the African diaspora and Afro descendants that were scattered and placed in different areas and how we have this interconnectedness, but also our histories, that long
mm,
line of history that predates enslavement, that
mm.
starts with the beginning of humankind, that it encompasses so much of the human story. That is what we need to be uplifting more so that we can release ourselves from the bondage of feeling like we don't deserve or
Mm.
don't shouldn't have access to our own ways of being or seeing ourselves as full human beings.
It makes me think earlier, a bit, we kind of circled around this notion of respectability politics,
Yeah.
how that creeps into the equation. Often, at least from my perspective, wealth accumulation seems to kind of parallel a certain kind of growth in respectability politics. People say, no, you got money now. You need to kind of move and talk like this and be like this in the world. But also, you stress the importance of reclaiming our cultural heritage, um, allowing that to proliferate through pedagogy. It really brings me right to the next letter in our equation here, the T, which is for thought, Black thought. So we're thinking about education, but also like Black epistemologies, different knowledge systems, ways of knowing, ways of being. Because Black living this has to go hand in hand with like Black thought, right? We have to be able to like
Yes.
go into that. Um, so I'm curious, yeah, what are your ideas around just education, reclaiming that as a mode of wealth accumulation?
Oh, I think it's something that is powerful. And I always lean back on Dr. John Henrik Clark. I always lean back on him because I feel like he kind of unlocked the key to getting people to really understand what it means to be black in the world and to be African or a person of African descent.
Mhm.
And I think that part of unlocking that key is storytelling, being able to
Ooh,
tell our stories. So just like it unlocked the key for me to learn about my family's own history, it would open up a whole new world for our children to be able to tell all these different stories. I had a professor who was a mentor of mine. She passed away uh, last year, Dr. Mishri Gathai Mugo, and
okay.
she's a Kenyan scholar, and she's Kikuyu, and she talked about how the Kikuyu way of learning was was communal, and every child had access because they would sit around and telling the children stories, and these stories had anecdotes and meanings and things that would guide your life. And these are things that we can tap into for the various African cultures and African American history and hoodoo history and maroonage history and all of the different things to really help our children and future generations gain access to thought. The thing, well, access to um, Africana thought. And
Hmm.
that was one of the benefits of when I studied under Dr. Imwali Mushuja. He taught us more than Black history. He taught us how to deconstruct the world around us and understand how anti Blackness was basically erasing us from the history books and preventing us from learning our own history. And so, and that impacts the way that you think. And that is
Yes.
exactly what Dr. Carter G. Woodson was talking about in the miseducation of the Negro. And today I call it the misinformation of the Negro because of everything that's going on in digital media, but it's still the same.
Yes.
And it is utilizing misinformation, miseducation in order to make us feel subhuman or not good enough.
Mm.
Um, and that's also what Marcus Garvey was tapping into with us, trying to instill pride in future generations. There's so many different thoughts that I could go there with it, but those are just
Yes.
some initially.
Well, we got to have you back on. I know we want to access those thoughts. Thank you so much. Before we let you go, we want to get to this H,
Okay.
which we've talked about as health. Now, I've often heard this quote that wealth can't buy health. Some people may disagree with that, but I'm curious how that lands with you. What does health look like in the most holistic capacity, from an infrastructural level to an individual level?
I think infrastructural, definitely for communities having access to fresh fruits and vegetables and clean water and clean air and clean land and not having pollutants everywhere. I think about that initially in terms of health. And then also on an individual level, of course, all of those very same things impact you, but every person is also different. So health also for me includes having access to care for your specific needs for what's going on with your body, your mind, your spirit.
Mhm.
And so there's just so many different components to that. But for me, health encompasses um, being able to feel and have that inner energy and have this robustness for life that is also supported by a communal mechanism so that you can get access to health care and all of the things that you would need to survive.
Absolutely. Absolutely. My goodness. Before we let you go, Jessica, just got two last questions for you. Don't
Okay.
want to put you on the spot, but we love to package Black History Year as an educational resource for folks. I would love to know any text or books, readings, articles, or just learning materials in general that kind of really supported your journey into learning more about your history and particularly around reparations. Any books or any scholars out there you want to shout out that folks should check out?
Yes, check out Nikichi Taifa. She has a new book, Reparations on Fire. And she was one of the founding members of the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America. And she also runs the Reparation Education Project. I also ask people to always read Dr. Carter G. Woodson's Miseducation of the Negro, a classic. Um, what else? I'm trying to think of the ones that I lean on heavily, and I'm drawing a blank here. But those are two off the top of my head that I would encourage people to read or look to. Um, I also have a book out that is
Yes.
called Black Voices: Inspiring and Empowering Quotes from Global Thought Leaders.
All
And the
right.
book
No.
features quotes from across the Pan African world so that you can learn more about various people, famous and not famous,
Mm,
academics but artists and lawyers and media personalities and musicians and all of the different thoughts on culture, education, arts, black thought, Pan Africanism, history, etc.
nice, nice. Oh, we got to check that out. Thank you. Thank you so much for lifting up that text. Can't wait for us to get our hands on that internally here at Push Black. And we got to have you back on to just to talk and think through that text just alone. But got one last question for you. Since we are in the future section, we are thinking speculatively. I want to just have a fun question to leave us with. Jessica, if we could invent a new title for our government, right?
Oh,
Or new position within our government. And let's say this position gets to control all economic activity in this country, all trade that's happening with other countries, whatever, whatever, pass any law that you want. Let's say you were leading this position. What would you decide to do? You could just wave a magic wand and just change something today. What would that be?
anything. Is it one thing or is it
Yeah,
everything? one
I
one
know it's
thing.
hard.
It's one thing.
Yeah, I hate to limit it to one thing, especially we talking so comprehensively about wealth, reparations. I know it's structural and all that, but what's one thing you would want to see done immediately?
Free housing for all people of African descent in America
That's
immediately, and the demilitarization of the United States. But
a-
I know you said one thing, but I was yeah, free housing.
all right, all right. We're gonna let you have that last word. Jessica Ann Mitchell Aiwuyor, thank you so much for taking time to meet with us. We appreciate all your knowledge, all your expertise, all the jewels that you dropped for us today. And yeah, we're not gonna hold you too much longer. Hope to have you back on. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
That was Jessica Ann Mitchell Aiwuyor, founder of the National Black Cultural Information Trust. To learn more about our work, visit nbcit.org. That's nbcit.org. And don't y'all forget, wealth is bigger than money. Wealth is an acronym. It stands for wellness, economics, agency, livingness, thought, and health. Now, how do you plan on cultivating wealth in your life starting today? If you found this conversation valuable, please share this episode on your social media. Be sure to tag us at We Are PushBlack on IG and TikTok. Thank y'all. At PushBlack, we agree with Marcus Garvey when he said, a people without knowledge of their past history, origin, and culture is like a tree without roots. We believe telling empowering stories on Black life and history can build a more liberated Black future. Being here with us lets us know you probably feel like that's important too. You matter. Your choice to be here matters. It lets us know that you value this work, and you make PushBlack happen with your contributions at blackhistoryyear.com. Most people do $5 or $10 a month, but everything makes a difference. Thank you for supporting the work.